we were driving through there and we're speeding, and then we get pulled over by a cop. And that's not good because we have like tons of weed in the car. You know, we're speeding in Utah. We're these like outsider kids.
Hello, my atypical daydreamers, and welcome to Season 3. I love making this podcast, and it's great to be back. Today's tale takes us through the American West on a journey that I shared many years ago with my old friend and longtime writing partner, Robert Bell, or Bob, as I know him. The goal was to write a Western while on the road, but the road has its way of flipping the script.
We had this plan. We'd been working on a screenplay idea, a story about a Mormon Western. And the plan was we were going to write the whole screenplay while being on the road in Utah. So we had never been to Utah. It was going to be like firsthand research with the Mormons and drive all around Utah and Idaho where the story was supposed to take place and write it in the car. We were going to have a laptop. I remember getting like a special charger plug and that plugged into the laptop so we could write supposedly the entire time we were on the road. We went to Hollywood that day that we were going to leave, and we went to the rental car place. I probably booked it, and it was probably just like a crappy compact car that I had booked. That's usually, I booked the cheapest thing. But they upgraded us to a Mustang, and this became like this big fortuitous sign that this was meant to be where we're going to ride around the West on a Mustang, riding a Western.
I think we left that day, and our goal was to get to Zion National Park in Utah. But first, we were like, Vegas is on the way. We should stop. And it would have been around dinner time. We didn't want to go to the Strip, so we went downtown to Fremont Street. Right away, for both of us, it just felt like some kind of zombie land. People walking around. It's like all their faces were like elongated, and they were drinking these giant drinks. And for some reason, then I asked a cop that I saw if they had any recommendations of places to eat. And he told us about some Italian place that was right there somewhere around. I don't remember anything really about the place, if it was good or bad, but I do remember that the waiter would sometimes have an Italian accent and other times not have the Italian accent. So we just got out of town quick and headed towards Zion. And on the way, there was this lightning storm like all around, but there was no rain. It was just like lightning in the sky. So we drove on through this like electric night, and we finally got to Zion. And it was late. It was, I don't know, probably early in the morning, actually, sometime. We wake up the next morning, and it's like we're in some magical, it looks like the mountains are like chiseled by giants. It's really a mind-blowing kind of place.
We drove on because we were pushing through. The whole plan was like within a week, we were going to loop through all of Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and then back down the West Coast to LA. So that's a big trip. I think right away we weren't riding. And, I think we were talking about the story a lot and the characters, but I don't recall putting very much to page at all.
So our next stop was Provo. We wanted to visit the campus of BYU, Brigham Young University Mormon School. Check out Provo, thought it was a college town. You go to the college towns to find the cool record shops and the coffee shops and, like hippie food. This was not that kind of a college town. I know that right when we got into town, though, pretty quickly there was a cop car that was following us a bit, probably just checking our plates, checking us out. Who are these strangers? We made our way to BYU, and it's a beautiful campus. We definitely weren't part of the gang. A very clean campus, and with a lot of clean-looking youth. Nice people. Everybody seemed so nice, smiling, looking at us, smiling. I didn't get any dirty looks. Again, we looked pretty scruffy. I had a big mustache and Bob was unshaven, and I was for some reason wearing like a bandana around my forehead. And there was something strange about like the way the campus functioned. It was like the rhythm and the flow of the campus was different than I'd ever experienced before. I couldn't totally put my finger on what it was, but it was just different. Bob and we've been in a lot of situations that are awkward. And I think we've put ourselves in some of these on purpose, to be the outsider. It feels really good in this way. Somehow you feel more alive, more alert.
I definitely felt like an outsider. I'll say that. I've had those experiences before of just going into a place and walking around and being the outsider and getting to observe. And I think BYU was very much like that, and especially since we were writing a story about Mormons. So yeah, we carried on. And I remember that was also kind of the first taste of fall. Like it was still summery everywhere else, but like it was an indicator we were going north because I saw the leaves were changing up in Provo. So we went on to Salt Lake City that night. And we were staying in a hostel. This part of the country felt very like desolate to me. I think we met people and stuff, but no one left like an impression. And we just sort of were wanderers kind of going through. Driving up from Salt Lake, we kind of cut through Wyoming and then into Idaho, but like northern Utah into Wyoming. This is a very like super kind of desolate area of the country, like the beautiful parts of these respective places. Like there's so much beauty between like Wyoming and Idaho and Utah. And like you get almost none of that kind of the route that we were driving. But we were driving through there and we're speeding and then we get pulled over by a cop. And that's not good because we have like tons of weed in the car. We're speeding in Utah. We're these like outsider kids. Like he saw the laptop, right? And he asked us what we were doing. We told him we were writing a screenplay. And I think we told him a little bit about it too. Like it was this Western and stuff. And he just seemed kind of enchanted by it. And so he let us go. He did nothing to us, which is just like the hallmark of privilege, I guess. And then we drove on through, Wyoming. We ended up in Boise. We went to a quarter of the city that's like 6th Street in Austin or Bourbon Street, or, it was just like a bunch of frat boys and we weren't feeling it at all. And then we turned and went down a side street and ended up in this like saloon. And in my memory, it really does feel like an old-timey Western saloon. Like there would be a gal named Lil and a piano player and stuff. And there's this man at the bar. And I've been thinking about him, knowing I was going to like tell this story. And I just feel like he just felt like he'd always been there. Like he was sort of like the ancient mariner or something. Like he was there to sort of like he was waiting to tell us the story or tell me the story, not so much Josh. And he would talk directly to me. So we just struck up a conversation because we were sitting next to him. He right away, he kept saying that I was a true gentleman. And he told me, a very sad story about his experience in Vietnam and the traumas he'd endured. It's one of those things about this particular story I've been thinking about too, which was there are these characters that come out in the story that are, somewhat humorous in some ways because they sort of appear to us and they do these funny things. Like he kept calling me a gentleman. But it's also really sad because, he was a broken man. And I think he did spend his days and nights at that bar stool. But he really wanted to tell someone about it. And so that was my role that night, was to be there to listen to him. I don't know his name. I wish I knew some of these folks' names. I think it was Bill or something, but that's coming out of the haze, 20 years later.
Hey, Josh here. I love making this podcast, and I'd love to make it my full-time gig. Besides telling the stories, I'm basically a one-man band, and that takes time. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider becoming a patron. You'll have access to loads of great bonus stories, and you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting a truly independent podcast. Find the Patreon link in the show notes. And thanks. So we moved on to Oregon, and there was some state park that we had found along the way that we were going to stop and we were going to camp in. We had some mushrooms with us, and we were going to take mushrooms in the state park. We didn't have a campsite, or we were just winging it. We finally found a spot to camp. First, we went to the place you're supposed to camp, like the area that's reserved for camping, and there were a lot of people there. So we were like, we can't take mushrooms here. So we were like, let's just go back up the road a little bit. There was another spot that was part of the park too, but you weren't supposed to camp there. We decided to camp there anyway. And so we unloaded some. Bob went into town to make a call because there was no reception there. And I stayed behind, and I was just sitting there alone. Again, we were like kind of far away from where all the people were. And then kind of out of nowhere, it's like they appeared. This old couple just started walking toward me. Eventually they came over, they said hello and were asking, what's going on, or like curious and asking, I said, my friend and I are going to camp here. And they were like, oh, good, and at some point I asked about bears. I said, are there bears around here? Should we be worried about bears? Because we're going to camp here. The older man said, oh, no, you're fine. I grew up around here. I've been coming here my whole life. You're fine. There's no bears. So I was like, great, good, and that put me at ease. But then he's like, well, if you want to know about bears, though, and he starts telling me about how he spent time in Alaska and like the backcountry, and there were like grizzly bears there, and they'd have these like giant fires, and they would be sitting around them, and you could hear the bears moving around. He'd say you could hear the bears just beyond where the light would reach, and you could hear them snapping their jaws. And like, I was like, what are you telling me all this for? And then they had somewhere to go or something, and then they just started, it seemed like they almost vanished. And it was like right after that they were gone, that Bob showed back up. And I was like, Bob, there were this old people, and they were talking about bears, but there's no bears here, but then there's bears in Alaska. And after all that, we, with bears in our mind, we decided to still go ahead with taking the mushrooms. And it was fun at first. As the night went on, it got pretty cold, and I don't think we had a lot to eat. And at some point, we started hearing these really weird, like, they sounded like spaceships. And then you would see these cars kind of go by in the distance. I think what we figured out was that these like kids in the area or whatever were like drag racing up there, or just driving around really fast. And so they just kept coming by like super fast. In my state of mind, I was thinking they're like spaceships. We're thinking about bears, and it's cold, and we don't have a lot of food, and there's like spaceships flying around. So I would say it was a little tense and almost like, what, was this worth it? This is definitely not the first time I've taken mushrooms. Why did I come back here? Do I need to do this anymore? So eventually we fall asleep, and then suddenly there's like someone going, hey, wake up, come on, get up. And we're in our tent and come out really quick. It's super early, and there's a forest ranger there. And he's like, guys, you're not supposed to be camping in this spot. You need to pack up quick and get out. And we were like, oh, okay. And we're still out of it. And so we're packing up, and he just stood there while we did it. And we jumped in the car. And
it was getting on evening, got to the California border, and we took the split off. So there's that main highway, I forget the name of it, but then you can split off toward Crescent City, which is by the bay. In my memory, it was like, I want seafood. Like I want seafood by the bay. And so we split off from the inland highway, and that takes you like basically through Ewok land, like through the big trees, like the big old redwoods. And it's just beautiful. That was one of those moments where I felt like time stopped, and, there was just this hush in the woods, and we were listening to like early gospel singers or something, I think, from like the Anthology of American Folk Music. It was something otherworldly. And so by the time we got to Crescent City, the sun was setting, and there's a ton of sea lions on the bay, and they're these big old bodies. And I remember walking toward them at a certain point, and they just all started barking at me. So you don't want to get near the sea lions.
So then we find our way into some seafood joint, some seafood shack, and order some food, and we're sitting down. I think we're at like a community table, if I remember right, or something like that. And there's this older fella sitting with us who starts talking to us. And immediately it was like, this guy is a pirate. And his voice was insane. It was like deep and grovelly, and he had barnacles growing inside of his throat. And not to reduce everybody that you meet on the road to a character, but this was like another strange character. And I couldn't tell you what we talked about, but he was very encouraging. I think we told him about our trip. And I think after the Redwoods and the music and the seafood, and really in this moment, it felt like this is exactly where we're supposed to be. You know, like nothing else really matters. We are where we're supposed to be at this point in our lives. And so we finish up our meal and we move on. And we're trying to get to Arcata that night. You know, another college town. We thought like, well, this has got to be good. It's the home of like Humboldt State University. This town has got to be all lit up, right? And we hadn't gotten gas in Crescent City. And this is a stretch of Northern California where there were just like no gas stations. And it was getting late. And, you know, so if there were gas stations, they were closed. And you go through that one town where there's like the giant Paul Bunyan statue with Babe the ox, the blue ox. And like that at night is super spooky and ghostly. And it's like misty up there. So it's spooky. But we found a gas station. We got gas. We made it. We made it to Arcata. And so we have these high hopes. And right as we get into town, it's like, no, this is a rough spot. This is like, it just felt like a town full of roughnecks and like crusty dudes and just like hot. It just felt hostile. And I just remember it felt like people were yelling a lot. And of course we went to a bar, and at one point this guy's like running across the bar, and he like pukes like a exorcist style, like just puke flies out of his mouth and it hits the ground kind of like right behind us. And like, I felt like nobody did anything, or I don't remember. It just like, now I do have to say that like, this is toward the end of a really intense trip. Like we were doing a lot of miles every day. We were smoking a lot of weed and drinking every night pretty hard, probably not getting enough sleep, constantly pushing everything to the edge. So like our state of mind also could have been a big part of this too. Like I do think that town was kind of intense, but I think also we were getting a little dark at this point. This was just where those two things met, this like intense place and our twisted state of mind at that point. So that was Arcata. And then we pressed on the next morning.
And here's the crazy thing was, I think, so this is like the length of California. We had to make it back to LA that night, or like the next day we had to make it to LA by that night. I don't know if you had obligations. It might have been that I was flying back out. And we decided to like drive the coastal road, which is like the slowest way that you can make it through Northern California. It was beautiful, but we didn't make San Francisco until like probably 6 o'clock. The sun was going down, and we still stopped for dinner there. And like once that was over, it's like, holy shit, we got to make it to LA. And it was just like a push, you know, that night. I think we were both pretty well spent by the end of this trip. And I don't think we had probably 100 or 200 words on our screenplay written by the end of this trip either. I don't think we've written like anything, but it was really fun. Obviously, it was such a time, you know, like late 20s for me and just turning 30 for you, that always stands out. And I haven't had that sort of intimate experience with like driving across America since then. Like I've taken other driving trips, but not like an epic road trip like that, where I'm really like, you know, we didn't spend a lot of time in each town, but we're getting into each town and we're like going to the bars and talking to the people. And like, that was really indelible. Like, I'll always remember that.
I drove the last little leg, and this is like through the night. And I remember, I think I was pretty high actually when I did this part. I don't know why I got high before this, because it was just like interstate and big trucks and like maneuvering around them. It felt like it felt like a really horrible video game. And I think there was a bit of like apprehension. There was a bit of tension. There was a bit of anxiety about going back to LA, you know, almost like this idea of like, we went to space and now we're in the capsule and we're coming back into the atmosphere, and it's like burning up the side of the capsule as you re-enter the atmosphere. And I think one thing to remember with this whole trip is this is before smartphones, you know, like you're not constantly taking pictures and posting, you know, or reading about something online. You know, you're just disconnected at this time, you know. This is like really the last little stretch of time when you could travel like this and just really kind of be lost wherever you are and forget about the rest of the world. I think that's partly why this trip feels like the last of its kind for me. And I think for Bob too. I've never taken a trip like this since, not anywhere close. This, you know, trying to be like fear and loathing. And, you know, I have kids now, and like, I probably would be freaked out if I heard this story from one of them, but like some 20-something son, and he told me a story like this, I might have a little bit of a panic attack, you know? It's like really scary, but it makes sense. This is what you do at this time in your life, possibly. It could be a regrettable thing, taking these kind of chances. This is probably bad advice, but maybe the Butthole Surfers had it right when they said, well, son, a funny thing about regret is it's better to regret something you have done than something you haven't done. I want to thank Bob for helping me bring this story to life. This podcast was created and produced by me, Josh Caldwell. Music by Visual Aid, my side music project. General support and copywriting by Miranda Caldwell. If you like the show, please follow, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to financially support the show, check out my Patreon page. You'll have access to loads of great bonus stories. You can find the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back next week.